Welcome. S- As our community on the school evolves, as Rivka's table evolves, there's some new things. Some of the ideas are coming from you guys, and I really appreciate that. So I want to mention two of them. One is actually Beth Ann told me that in another class that she had, the teacher gave out a sheet of all of the Hebrew terms that she used in the class with the English translation. Now, that was an interesting idea because usually, as you know, when I teach, I try to use both simultaneously, but I did create just a few of the vocabulary words that are part of today's lesson with their English translation, and I only remembered to post it just like 3 minutes ago. So if you go into the community tab on school, you'll find it there. I will attach it to the recording of this lesson um, when when I post the lesson. And I don't even know if you guys need it. So I do want to know, it doesn't take me a lot of extra work to do, but I do want to know if you find it helpful. If you had it a little bit in advance, it might have been more helpful. But again, I will in my I when I teach, I like to use the authentic Hebrew names for characters in Tanakh, but also to translate it for you so that yeah, so that you can follow along. Okay. The other thing is, and this idea came from Teresa, that she joined us later. And over the years that we've been studying together, I periodically send you or I speak about a book that I recommend. So some of you may have seen this because I did it earlier today, but in the community, I put a new course where I listed the title and the author and a link to all of the books that I've mentioned over time that I could I had to what do you call it? I had to, whatever. I had to put it all together again because I wasn't doing it on an ongoing basis. But then I saw it just sort of this random list of books, and I thought that's crazy. Let me try to organize this for you a little. So I organized them into categories. So there are books that talk about sort of the intersection between Christianity and Torah. There's books that talk about women in Torah. There's books that are focused on Torah values or Torah concepts, books that are about the Noahide identity. I can't remember all the categories, but I put them, obviously books about redemption and end of days, that kind of stuff. So I put them in categories. So where you find it is if you go into the school community and you go into classrooms, the classroom, you will find a new division that is called Rivka's bookshelf. And I actually took a picture of, I mean, I have a million bookshelves, thank God. But I took a picture of what, so all those books are on my Women in Torah bookshelf. They're actually my books, some of which are on the list. So it's sort of a curated list for you guys if you're interested in growing your Jewish library or you're interested in a deeper dive into anything that we talk about. So I wanted to mention that to you. And then also I have another sort of introductory comment that has it's an issue that has been at play in my life the last couple of weeks. Some of you know because I mentioned it on the group that there's this Facebook group called Christians Today Need Torah. And there's like almost 50,000 people in this group. And I joined the group thinking, oh, maybe I could be helpful to them. And some of you know that that has been somewhat frustrating for me because they have an approach that is very different from the approach that you guys have. And I want to read you something. This is, well, I'm not sure if I told you this already, but let me say it again in this context. This is one of their group rules. Okay, their group rule is no Talmud, Kabbalah, Noahide law teachings. We proclaim and teach only the eternal word of our Father, which most certainly includes the Torah written by Moses. We teach nothing else on this page, and we certainly do not post any of the doctrines of men that come from the Yeshua-hating religion of Orthodox Judaism. Okay, now I have been doing this work a long time, so like I get where they're coming from. I have met people who basically are trying to do Torah without Jews and without any rabbinic tradition. And, like good for them, 100 years ago, there were no Christians interested in doing anything that had to do with Torah. So there's some progress there. But they're not quite where you guys are. Okay. And it occurred to me this week. I have these colleagues, I would say that there's probably 20 or maybe 30 English speaking Jews in Israel who do something like what I do with you guys. Okay. Some of them, the most famous ones that are Jeremy Gimpel and Ari Abrahamowitz. Of you are probably part of their Sunday fellowship. But there are other people. And so we have this sort of dialogue going on among us about whether or not to be insulted by or offended by or whatever for Christians who are like this. And it's an interesting conversation among us. I'm not going to go into details, but this has been on my mind very much this week, and it occurred to me there's a subset of Jews. I think they're Jews. I'm not always Jews. There's a subset of people whose approach to the Torah is they are known as the Karaites, and you may have heard of this
Oh
group.
yeah.
Yes. Okay. And the Karaites basically only follow the written Torah, which sounds like what what this group is about. And it occurred to me that that's their approach. Now, um, I don't know if I have ever shared with you a class on what the oral Torah is, why it's important, but I certainly wrote a chapter about it in the book. Whoops, hang on, I'm just going into my bookshelf here, which you can't see. It's not funny. It looks like I'm just going to pull this out of the
Yes.
sky. Okay. I don't know if you can even see this. Okay, the book is called Lighting Up the Nations, and there's a chapter in here. You can get a Kindle version or whatever, but there is a chapter here on um, let me find it first. It's basically about the importance of oral Torah and why it doesn't make sense to I don't want to waste your time here. I should have found it before. Um, oh, the oral Torah dilemma, it's called. Okay. And I don't know if I mentioned this story to you before, but one time years ago, when my first book came out and groups were still coming to Israel because there was before COVID, before the war, all that stuff, I was speaking to a group about the concept of non-Jews being on some path, some Torah awakening path. And I had this idea that I was going to do a Shabbat experience for people and invite them to come somewhere in Israel, like on a kibbutz or something like that. And we would have all Jewish teachers. We would have an authentic Shabbat experience, and we would have teaching during the Shabbat, in addition to the meals and the fellowship and so forth. And this one woman said, "Well, that would be great as long as you don't teach Talmud." And and I kind of fell off my chair because I didn't understand like where that comment came from. But I understand now that there are people who are very, very wary of anything that's not written in the Bible. That is not the Torah approach. That's not the Jewish approach. It warrants a deeper discussion, but I just wanted to point out that I did see in this group of these Christians that are trying to observe Torah, but without any Jewish teachers and without any oral Torah to guide them, the amount of, I don't want to be too harsh, but the amount of ignorant comments that are made or misinformed comments that are made is just eye-popping. Um, and I wish I could help them, but they don't want to hear from me, so I'm leaving that aside. Okay, let's that was a lot of introduction. Let's focus on Beshalach. Okay. Okay, so the Parsha of this week's Parsha is Beshalach, which comes from Shemot, from the book of Exodus, chapter 13, verse 17 to chapter 17, verse 16. And the Haftarah, interesting, comes from a book we have not had a Haftarah from yet, from the book of Shoftim, which is the book of Judges. Okay, so it comes from the book of Judges, chapter 4, verse 4 to chapter 5, verse 31. I'm going to do a summary very quickly just to orient you what is going on in the Parsha Beshalach, a summary of the book of Shemot, I'm sorry, of the book of Shoftim, of the book of Judges, and a summary of the Haftarah. And then we'll talk about the parallels, the universal wisdom, and practical applications that we can pull from this, okay? But there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. And because the Haftarah is more narrative than prophetic, it's much easier to teach and to derive value from, I think. Okay. Now, so the name of the Parsha, Beshalach, means when he sent. It's found in Exodus 13:17. It refers to when Paro, let the people go when he sent them out of Egypt. Okay, who was the he? Was Pharaoh, and what was he sending? He was sending the Israelites out of Egypt. So then you know what happens. Right after he allows them to leave, he chases them to force their return because he has remorse. And then the Israelites find themselves trapped on the one hand between the armies of Paro in the back and the sea in the front. God tells Moses to raise his staff over the water. The sea splits to allow probably the most famous. I think if you spoke to people who know nothing about the Bible, they probably know about this scene. Okay, the water splitting to allow the Israelites to pass through, and then it closes over the pursuing Egyptians. So as soon as basically the Israelites get out and the Egyptians come in, the water reverts and drowns all of the enemy Egyptian soldiers. And so Moshe and the children of Israel are on the other side of the shore, and they are singing a song of praise and gratitude to God. Um, Famous, famous, famous. Okay, in the desert, the people suffer thirst and hunger. They're complaining all the time to Moshe and Aaron, to Moses and Aaron. And then we have the episode where God miraculously sweetens the bitter water of Marah, and later he asks Moses to bring forth water from a rock by striking it with his staff. Um, and then he causes manna, mun, to rain down from heavens before dawn each morning, and also for quails to appear in the Israelite camp every evening. I'm just summarizing the parsha so that we can go on to the juicier stuff. Not that this isn't juicy, by the way, but this isn't it's not our main focus for tonight. The children of Israel are instructed to gather a double portion of this manna, of this mun, on Friday, so because none is coming on Shabbat, because that's the divinely decreed day of rest. Some people don't pay attention to this rule. They disobey and they try to gather on Shabbat, but they find nothing. And Aaron preserves a small quantity of this in a jar as a testimony for future generations, which gives me chills when I think about it, because I think that when we find this stash, we will probably, it'll be in a museum somewhere, and we will be able to go to Jerusalem. I'm assuming it'll be in Jerusalem, and go and see a jar of this original supernatural mun. Okay. Um, Now, you all probably are very well aware that this week, the news reported that the Israeli army found the bones or the whatever's left of the body of the last remaining hostage. And one of the things that was pointed out is that in this week, so the week before a parsha is read, so the parsha will be read on Shabbat, the entire week is considered the week of Beshalach. One of the things that happen in the Parsha is that the Israelites take out the bones of Joseph, when they leave. If you look in Shemot chapter 13, verse 19, and Moshe took the bones of Yosef with him, for Yosef, had strictly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely remember you, and you shall carry up my bones with you. So this idea of taking bones from one country to another, it gave the entire country chills when somebody pointed it out. That this is the week that the bones of the last remaining hostage in Gaza were carried out of Gaza. I'm sure you see the connection. Also, another connection is that the IDF, they had intelligence that he was buried in this certain cemetery, and they examined 249 other graves. They had all these forensic specialists and so forth to figure out, is this him? Is this him? Because I don't know what's left of the body, where they were told to search. And the 250th body that they checked was Ram. And what's fascinating about that is that the numerical value of his first name is 250. So that's also a very it's like a kiss from Hashem. Okay, Sefer Shoftim, the Book of Judges. Let's do a yes. Yeah, it gives me chills too. Okay, let's do a summary. It's the second book in the section of prophets. So the first one is Yehoshua, which is Joshua, and Shoftim, Judges, is the second book. Who wrote Shoftim? It's ascribed to Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet. And the Sefer covers a period of about 400 years, which are the most turbulent years in all of biblical history. During the entire time period that are covered in this book, except for certain decades of quiet after one of the judges achieved some miraculous military victory, the Israelites were constantly being terrorized by other nations who were still living in the land of Israel. There was also rampant idol worship. So just so you get an idea of what's going on, because it's going to be relevant for our Haftarah. By the way, Psalm 83 mentions a lot of the enemies that were um, problematic at the time, particularly at the time that two of the judges, Devorah and Gidon, ruled. Now you may know them as Deborah and Gideon. Uh, there are a lot of strong and spiritually elevated women in this book, in the book of Judges. Its pages are full of the stories of women who take action. It has I don't know that it's not that there's no women who take action in any other books of Torah, but this particular book, the book of Judges, has a lot of them. Um, okay, so what we see is this constant pattern of the Israelites engage in idol worship. God lets other nations, the Midianites, the Philistines, whomever the enemies are, attack them and harm them. The Israelites come back to Hashem in some way. And so Hashem sends a leader to fight their battles against this enemy. And all is quiet for a few decades until that leader dies. And then it happens again, over and over and over and over again. That every generation abandoned God in times of peace. There are 15 judges in total. The first five chapters portray strong leaders who led the people to military victory and inspired them to spiritual growth. Um, I'll name them for you. And then I want to tell you a funny story. The judges were Othniel, which is a city in Israel today, Ehud, Shamgar, and Devorah. Devorah is our Haftarah is all about Devorah. We're going to talk about that later. But Shamgar in Israel is the name of um, a funeral home in Jerusalem. And I knew the name Shamgar, but I until I was preparing, I didn't realize that he was one of the judges that's mentioned in the book of Judges. So I'm telling this, and my husband and I are waiting we're in this like waiting room, and there's another English speaking couple there. And I'm telling him that, and the woman says to me, "Oh, I live in such and such a neighborhood in Jerusalem, and the Shamgar funeral home is right near my house." So that was just a little moment we had. Okay, anyway, later judges, the most famous of whom are Yiftach, who you may know as Jephthah, and Shimshon, who you know as Samson, were weaker judges. They were not like so good for the country. But the book does end. It's sort of bookcased. No, that's not the right word. What do you call it? Bookended. That's it. The book ended. So they're strong judges in the beginning of the period, weak judges in the middle of the period, and two strong leaders at the end, Eli Cohen, the high priest Eli, and Shmuel Hanavi, who is the author of the book, Samuel the prophet. Okay. So the prophet Samuel would have written or edited this book during a very specific transitional moment in Israelite history. It's right at the transition between tribal leadership, which devolved into tribal chaos because there was no, the population is growing and growing and growing, and like nobody's running the store. And you'll see that that becomes relevant in the story of Devorah, but we'll talk about that. To national leadership. What does national leadership mean? A king. Okay. So we're talking approximately late 11th century BCE. So the book is written or comes into the world as the period of the judges basically is over. Okay. Just before the Israelite monarchy begins. And it begins, of course, with Shaul HaMelech, with King Saul. So at this stage, and at the stage of the Haftarah, Israel is still tribal, it's still decentralized, it's spiritually unstable, it's politically unstable. Leadership has been very temporary. In other words, when there's a crisis, a leader emerges, but there's no, in the nation, there's no sort of universally recognized leader for most of this period of time. And so that is, you can see how that is prime for external threats having their way with the people because there's nobody to fight, there's nobody to protect the people. So the biggest threat in the book of Judges is the nation known in Hebrew as the Plishtim or the Philistines. Okay. During the era of the book of Judges, Israel is fragmented, Israel's leaderless, and the Plishtim, the Philistines, are dominant. And in the story of Shimshon, in the story of Samson, his personal battles against the Philistines are symbolic of the fact that Israel has raw strength, but it has no national unity. And so the victories that Shimshon had, and I don't know that we've ever talked to, did I ever teach you about Delilah? I'm not sure I ever did, but anyway,
No.
okay, so that's another chapter for the women that I mostly wrote for the book I'm eventually going to publish someday when I finish it. Okay. Um, so this is what happens. The Plishtim, because the Philistines become sort of the catalyst or the incentive for Israel to realize we cannot survive as a congregation of loose tribes, which led to the rise of Israel's first king. Okay. And this concept of the people beginning to demand a king signals a shift in national consciousness. And so the prophet Samuel, shaped this book at the end of that period of time in these tense years when they realize the system we have right now isn't working. We need a better system. Um, so that's an overview of the book of Judges. However, our Haftarah comes sort of at the beginning of this period. Okay. So it is, as I said, it's in chapters 4 and 5 where the judge is Devorah, is Deborah. Okay. The Haftarah is about Israel's victory over not the Philistines, but the Canaanites, and particularly this Canaanite general called Sisera. Okay. So the prophetess and the judge um, is Devorah, and the military commander of the Israelites is a guy named Barak. There's some people who say that they were husband and wife, but it's only one opinion. In general, I don't know that everybody believes that. So the story takes place about 200 years after the conquest of the land in the time of Joshua. The conquest was left incomplete, and that means that there were pockets of Canaanites still dwelling in the land. The Canaanite threat in the time of Devorah was they were technologically advanced. They had a centralized regime that was economically, militarily, and culturally able to strangle Israel because Israel was this fragmented group of tribes. Okay. Israelites have no central government, no standing army, no means of funding or producing weapons. So along comes Sisera, who's the Canaanite general. He has 900, this is very explicit in the text, 900 iron chariots, which is equivalent to a tank in today's army. He had this overwhelming weapon advantage. Plus, at the time, each tribe was mostly concerned with their own territory. You remember that when Yehoshua brought the people into the land of Israel, by divine decree, each tribe was given a certain part of land, and without a central leadership, each tribe was mostly concerned about their territory. And so they were not united in the fight against this Canaanite enemy. So that's the atmosphere into which Devorah rose to lead this fractured nation. So not only is she the only female judge in the book of Judges, she's also the only one in the book of Judges besides the author Shmuel HaNavi, Samuel the prophet, who's also a prophet or prophetess. So the Talmud records that there were 7 women prophetesses: Sarah, Miriam, Devorah, Hannah, whose story is also in the book of Judges, Abigail, who was one of the first wives of King David, Huldah, which a lot of people don't know about, and Esther, as in Queen Esther. Okay. So Devorah is she's a judge, she's a prophetess, she's a powerhouse. So now there I also told you that there's this commander named Barak, this man who is the leader of the tribe of Naphtali, which is one of the northern tribes. Okay. So Devorah has conveyed. Now, by the way, the split between the Southern Kingdom and the Northern Kingdom, this is way before that. Okay, we don't even have a king yet. Um, but nevertheless, the tribe of Naphtali hid their territory is located in the north. So Devorah goes to Barak and he basically says, God is commanding you to go to battle against the Canaanite enemy. And he agrees, but he says, I'm only going to go if you come with me. And she's not like so impressed by his lack of uh, by his lack by him making that condition. And she predicts, and this is in chapter 4, verse 9, she predicts that there will be a victory, but the credit for the victory is going to go to a woman. So she says, I will go with you, but you will get no glory on this path that you are on, for by the hand of a woman, Hashem will sell out Sisera. Okay. So the battle turns when God disrupts nature itself, and sudden storms out of season neutralize these iron chariots, which throws Sisera's forces into chaos. Sisera flees on foot. Okay, so just picture this. There's heavy, heavy rains, which creates mud, which means that these powerful iron chariots are basically stuck in the mud and they are basically useless. So now all of the Canaanite soldiers are flipping out, and their general flees. And where does he flee to? He seeks refuge in the tent of a woman named Yael, who is not a Jewish woman. I don't know how you pronounce it, but I think you spell it Jael. That's probably how you've seen it. So you know who I'm talking about. And he thinks she's going to offer him safety, but actually she does quite the opposite. So who is this Yael person? She's the wife of a man named Hever, who is from another nation called the Kenites. They were a nomadic nation. They were descended from the father-in-law of Moses. And Sisera assumed that Yael would be loyal to him because her husband made a peace treaty with the king of Canaan, for whom he was the general. Okay. But he didn't know that in her heart, or Yael was actually loyal to the Israelites. So the husband and the wife did not vote for the same candidate. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So Yael invites him into her tent and he feels very safe because he thinks he's with the wife of an ally. He asks her for water, and you may be familiar with this part of the story that she gives him warm milk to drink to make him sleepy. Now, he's this big general and, a little more, he's not a toddler that like a little warm milk is going to make him like snooze off on his nappy nap. Okay. So this is the part I'm guessing you didn't know because it's a piece of Talmud. It's a piece of oral Torah that tells the rest of the story. And that is that the Talmud indicates that she seduced him in order to make him sleepy because assuming you've been with a man, you know what generally happens. Okay. But he was such a powerful person that according to the Talmud, she had to sleep with him 7 times before he finally fell asleep. I bet you didn't know that part of the story. Anyway, there are people who say she wasn't the active one. He seduced her. But in any case, they were intimate and he fell asleep. And while he was asleep, she took a tent peg and drove it into his head behind his eyes, and that was the end of Sisera. Okay. So Barak and his men are finishing their battle out in the battlefields. They realize that the general is missing. They go looking for him and they find him dead in Yael's tent. And that's sort of um, the what Devorah prophesied that the victory would be accounted to a woman. And so the Canaanim, the Canaanites are defeated and the Israelites return to God. Um, and that is sort of the beginning of the end of the Canaanite aggression, although obviously I told you that later in the book of Shoftim, in the book of Judges, there are problems with the Philistines and all that. Chapter 5 of the Haftarah is known as Shirat Devorah, the Song of Devorah, and it retells in poetic form the story that I just told you. It praises God. It honors the tribes who answered the call because they didn't all. Like there are 12 tribes, and Devorah said, look, we're embattled here. We need help. And some of the tribes didn't respond, but some did. Okay. It criticizes those who stayed on the sidelines, and it elevates Yael as a heroine. And the song closes with a vision of peace following this righteous struggle against his enemy. Now, let me take you a little bit deeper. That's sort of the summary of the Haftarah, but I want to go a little bit deeper and tell you this. The woman named Zipporah, I don't know what you call her in English, but this is the wife of Moses. Okay. If you remember the story, when Moses is going to return to Egypt to participate, to get the Israelites out, you have to stay with me because I'm in different time frames here. Okay. Now I'm going way back generations before in history. He takes Zipporah and his two young children with him, his two young sons. But at some point, he meets up with his brother, and his brother basically says to him, "Are you nuts bringing a woman and two small children into Egypt right now? Send them back to the safety of her father's house, and after this whole drama is going to be over, you can go back and get her." And that's basically what happened. So as a result, Zipporah missed all of the fireworks of what happened in Egypt. She missed the 10 plagues. She missed the splitting of the sea that happens in this parsha, and the song after it, which is known as Shirat Hayam, or the Song of the Sea. And that caused her great spiritual pain. So, according to Kabbalah, she was reincarnated in Devorah, who also sang a song, um, uh, and also experienced a great victory and also sang a song. So you can see how that um, with Tzipporah being able to experience it through the life of Devorah was like God um, giving her what she had missed in a previous lifetime, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. There's another connection. If I don't think I taught you this, but there's this whole bizarre story about Tzipporah circumcising their second son and saving Moshe's life. And that act took a lot of initiative and great courage, and it was rewarded, some say, by her being reincarnated as Devorah, because Devorah was also an unusually strong-willed woman. So there's another connection. Okay, let's talk about, so we've done the review of the Parsha, we've done a little bit of the Book of Judges, of kind of an overview, and now you know what's in this Parsha. I'm sorry, in this Haftarah. Let's talk about what the connections are. This is one of the Haftarot that is probably the most tightly connected to the Parsha. Remember, I told you at the beginning when we started this series, I told you that some of the connections are stronger than others. This one's super strong. So there's a lot of parallels. Let's go through them. In the Parsha, Israel escapes slavery in Egypt and confronts the army of Pharaoh, of Paro at the sea. And in the Haftarah, Israel's oppressed by Sisera and by the Canaanite army, and they also face a powerful military threat. So both texts begin with the same people, the same vulnerable people trapped by this overwhelmingly forceful enemy, and they both end with miraculous victory. Because just as the sea overwhelms the Egyptians in the Parsha, nature in the form of an unseasonable rainstorm defeats Sisera's chariots. Okay. So one of the things to think about is freedom sometimes comes at the exact moment when escape seems impossible. And these are two biblical stories, that illustrate this concept that we have an idea in Judaism that I didn't prepare this, so I'm doing this off the top of my head, but the idea is basically that even if there's a knife at your throat, you should not give up hope in Hashem, because salvation can come keharif ayin, which means in the blink of an eye. Okay. So both of these scenarios, they don't look good for a minute, and then God intervenes and the whole thing turns around. Okay. Um, a second parallel is demonstrating that divine help arrives after somebody demonstrates moral courage and trust. So at the sea, Israel has to move towards the water before the waters will split. So we know that I'm blanking on the name of the guy who walked into the water until the water was up to his nose and the sea split. I'm sorry, I don't have it. It'll come to me. Um, but somebody had to do that, right? They're facing the water, and one of the Israelites goes into the water. It's such a famous Nachshon. Thank you. Nachshon goes in, and he's like the sample of human courage. In the Haftarah, Barak has to go to battle at Devorah's command. Um, and so it's a scary thing. They both take on um, this scary step. So the idea behind it is that it's not enough to have faith, like, oh, God will provide, God will fix this, whatever. It also requires movement. And there's a sort of a way of looking at the world that we are not responsible for. This is what I'm going to tell you right now is something it took me years to understand. We are not responsible for the outcome of any particular scenario. We are, however, required to do it's called in Hebrew hishtadlut, which is like our natural human effort in every scenario. So Nachshon, when he walks into the sea, he does not know if he's going to drown or not. When Barak agrees to go into battle against the scary Canaanite army with a general that has 900 iron tanks, he doesn't know at that point that he's going to prevail. Similarly, in our lives, when we need a certain salvation, we have to take some kind of action. It doesn't guarantee an outcome because the outcome is in Hashem's hands, but it does require us to act. Um, okay. Another parallel is that in both scenarios, the enemy fell with the instruments of their own strength. I'll explain what I mean. In the Parsha, Egypt's greatest asset was their army and their chariot, and that becomes the instrument of their downfall in the sea, right? It's who gets drowned when the split sea reverts back to normal. Exactly the tools by which they were scaring the Israelites, chasing the Israelites. In the Haftarah, the same thing. Sisera's military power collapses because his defeat comes not through force, but through vulnerability of the fact that his iron chariots cannot go. Um, they can't go in the mud. Okay, so the sort of lesson here is that arrogance or power that comes from arrogance often carries the seed of its own destruction, and you can certainly see that in history when you see people who amass a certain kind of power and it comes with arrogance instead of humility, instead of understanding that Hashem has invested them with a certain kind of power for hopefully a good reason, and that they end up destroying themselves. Another parallel, which can't be missed, is women at the spiritual center of the story. So in the Parsha, Miriam leads the women in the Song of the Sea. And in the Haftarah, Devorah is leading the nation spiritually, prophetically, and then Yael comes in and delivers the final blow. So women appear not at the margins of these stories, at these decisive spiritual moments of redemption, both of which qualify for a song, but the idea is that redemption requires the full participation of women, morally, spiritually, and so forth. There's also the parallel of the song. We'll talk about this more in a minute, but victory is followed by song. So Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, is the poetic retelling of the salvation at the sea, and Shirat Devorah, the Song of Devorah, is the poetic retelling of the salvation with Sisera and the Canaanites. So both victories are sealed with song, not a speech, not a monument. It's music and poetry that preserves memory, expresses gratitude, tries to convey some sense of moral meaning for future generations. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this idea that there are 10 biblical songs. I'm going to just review them with you. Some of them are explicit, some of them are oral Torah. But the first, going in chronological order, the first is called the Song of Creation, which is sung by the universe at its creation. And it comes from actually the book of Eov, the book of Job. The allusion to it comes in the book of Job. The second, historically, is Shirat Hayam, the Song at the Sea, which is sung by Israel after crossing the Red Sea in Exodus 15 in this week's Parsha, led by Moshe and Miriam. Then we have the Song of the Well, which is sung in gratitude for water in the wilderness. That is in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verses 17 through 18. The Torah portion Ha'azinu that comes at the end of the 5 books of Moses is called the Song of Moses. That's Moses's last final prophetic song. He's summarizing the entire covenantal history between God and Israel. That's basically in Devarim, in Deuteronomy chapter 32. The Song of Yehoshua, the Song of Joshua, sung after Israel's victories upon entering the land, and that's alluded to in the book of Joshua, chapter 10. If any of you are taking notes on this, you don't have to work so hard. I'm happy to just copy and paste this and send it to you if you're trying to grab it all. Then we have the Song of Devorah, which is in this week's Haftarah, that Devorah and Barak sing after defeating Sisera, which is basically the book of Judges, chapter 5. We have the Song of Hannah, which is a song of gratitude that is in the first book of Samuel, chapter 2, which is sung by Hannah after she has a successful pregnancy. We have um, Shirat David, the Song of David, his song of thanksgiving after deliverance from his enemies, which is both in Second Samuel and also Psalm 18. I'm almost finished. Two more. There's the most famous one probably is Shir HaShirim, which you probably know as Song of Songs, which is this poetic song of love between God and Israel that is traditionally attributed to Shlomo Melech, to King Solomon, to there's one of the books that he wrote. And then there's one that we don't have yet, and that is the Song of Redemption. That this is the song that will be sung in the future redemption. And that obviously hasn't happened. And um, that is from the book of Isaiah. So we're still waiting to sing that song. Again, chills. Okay. Another parallel is that the leadership in both of these scenarios, both in the Parsha, Moshe leads through trusting God, even when the people are freaking out at the sea. And in the Haftarah, Devorah also leads with moral authority, with prophecy, with wisdom. They're both faithful leaders. Ideally, leadership is not based on charisma or power or a fat bank account or whatever, but on spiritual clarity. The most enduring leaders, and this is true whether we're talking about a national leader or we're talking about like a boss in a work situation or a teacher or a parent, that the best of leadership helps people align with a sense of higher purpose. And that's what both the Moshe did at the sea and what Devorah did in this scenario. Okay, let's go on. I told you there was a lot to talk about. Let's talk about some of the universal wisdom. There's the idea that moral courage can change history. So Devorah steps forward when others are hesitating. Also, Yael takes responsibility at a decisive moment. Neither of them are directed by nobody asks for formal permission, okay? Because real change often comes from ordinary people who act with courage when the moment demands it. Another bit of universal wisdom from these stories is that leadership means responsibility. I mean, there's a certain amount of power, but it's power for a purpose. So Devorah doesn't rule by force. She listens, she's a judge, she inspires other people to act. True leadership is a form of service. And the ability to awaken other people to do their best. And it's not, when I say true leadership, I mean like the best kind of leadership. It's not um it's forcing people to act a certain way because they're afraid. They're afraid they're going to lose their job. They're afraid they're going to get kicked out. They're whatever. Leadership, the best kind of boss, the best kind of national leader inspires and leads from a place of inspiration. Okay. Another universal lesson is that there's consequences to neutrality. So the Song of Devorah is critical of the tribes that chose to stay home while others risked everything to fight the Canaanites. So in moments of injustice or crisis, choosing not to act is itself a moral choice. Now, we all, just to relate this to our situation, we're all tiny players in this world stage, but many of us see what's going on with the good people of Iran, and we're like horrified and wish that like governments would do something already instead of just talking about it. So they are not neutral in their words, but they seem so far at this. Now it could happen any minute. It's certainly in Israel anticipating any minute, but we've been that way for a couple of weeks now. Um, but anyway, there are consequences of neutrality. Let me go on. Um, Sometimes heroes are unexpected. Yael is not a warrior. She's not a leader. She's a wife. She's not a Jew or an Israelite. She's the wife of this nomadic. She married into this nomadic tribe, but her decisive act alters the course of history. So we don't ever want to underestimate the impact of one person acting at the right moment. I don't think Yael gets enough credit for what she's done, generally speaking. So I just want to underscore that. Okay. Also, gratitude and reflection are essential. The victory in both cases, but we're speaking about the Haftarah, is not followed by just let's have a party. Yes, I would call her a righteous Gentile for sure. Um, okay, and Yael is another one of the chapters that I'm planning on including in the 10 Women from the Nations. But anyway, the victory that happens in um, after the Canaanites is not just like, okay, let's go party, let's all get drunk, but there's song, and the song includes reflection, what happened, what God did for us, gratitude, making meaning from it, pausing to acknowledge triumph, sacrifice, and lessons learned, transforms an event into a lesson for the future. So maybe you can think of a scenario where that's been relevant for you. Um, I probably over prepared because I'm looking at the time. But okay, there's also the the lesson of having hope after oppression. So the Haftarah mirrors the Song at the Sea because there's fear and then there's freedom. There's chaos and then there's order. So the wisdom of that is to remember that no matter how entrenched in evil or oppression or hard negative stuff, that renewal and liberation are always possible. That's a biblical lesson that is relevant for everybody all over. Um, okay. And the last lesson before we get to practical applications of any of this is that peace is the ultimate goal. Peace is such a huge value in Torah. I really could do an entire class on peace as a value and all the ways it expresses itself in Jewish life. And the story of the victory over Sisera and the Canaanites ends with the land resting for 40 years, which is the image of peace. The in in this way of thinking, the purpose of struggle is not struggle for its own sake. It's not to perpetuate endless conflict, but it's struggle for the purpose of creating lasting peace and stability. So just to summarize, the Haftarah Beshalach, the story of Devorah and Yael and Barak and Sisera and all that, teaches that history changes when people act um, with moral clarity. Also, the voices of women and outsiders. So Devorah and Yael are both women, and Yael is certainly an outsider. She's not part of the Israelite nation. Those voices are often overlooked, but those overlooked voices can become the very instruments of redemption. Our our sages teach that redemption will come in the merit of the righteous women. And this is like a taste of that. Let me try to conclude here with practical applications. Okay. That in our lives, where can we step forward if leadership is needed? So Devorah leads because the moment demands it, not because she's self-aggrandizing or seeking power. So where do you see confusion, injustice, or paralysis? Where can you ask yourself, what part of this is mine to address? You don't have to wait for titles or permission to act responsibly. So a modern example would be a teacher, a parent, a community member who takes initiative instead of saying, somebody should handle this. This is a problem. Somebody should fix this. I will say, I really think that our community is out of this because I never intended when I first started learning about people who weren't Jewish, who were interested in Jewish things or in ritual, who were like eating biblically clean and studying Parsha and celebrating Sukkot in some way or lighting Hanukkah candles or whatever. When I first learned about this, and we're going back more than 10 years, um, I did not say to myself, oh, I should like start a class and I should start teaching people. That was not like it took a while for that to evolve, but it came out of a realization when I published the second book about, and I saw how many people were hungry for what the Torah has to offer. And I know a little bit of Torah. So I stepped forward because I thought that there was space for that. So that's like an example of that practical application of this. I'm no devourer, but um, but I saw a need and I stepped in to fill it. Okay, another practical application is to act even when you're afraid. So we see in the text that Barak, he does not want to do this thing, but he still goes. Courage doesn't mean that you don't fear. It means you don't let fear decide what steps you're going to take. And one can always move forward with support if you can't do it alone. So he says to Devorah, I'll go, but you have to go with me. So um, even when you're the practical tip is that even when there's something you're afraid of, take one concrete step towards that anyway. Okay, we're not talking about nobody's going to put you in a position of going to war with an enemy nation. So it's something a little bit smaller in our lives. But what is something you're afraid of that needs to be done, and you can take one concrete step anyway. Okay, also in a time of moral crisis, don't stay neutral. So Shirat Devorah, the Song of Devorah, criticizes the tribes who did not get involved in this conflict. Silence in the face of wrongdoing, that is what supports the wrongdoing. And even small acts of support matter. So all of you, I know that some of you, when after October 7th, you started speaking out online and um, that is the exact opposite of staying neutral, right? You tried to educate who you could educate about the other side of the story. It's not an easy thing to do. And some of you stepped into that fray anyway. So ask yourself, um, is there a situation in my life where I'm staying neutral to stay comfortable, where really I should express moral leadership in my way, in my world? Um, okay. uh, Another practical application of this is use what you have wherever you are. So Yael is not a soldier. Okay. She's got this general in her tent. She uses what she has. Now we can talk about the morality of this married woman having intercourse with this enemy general, but I don't want to go there. She doesn't have weapons. She uses what she has. She has her ability to seduce him. She has a tent peg. You don't need the perfect tools or the ideal conditions in order to make a difference, right? She changed history with what she had in her tent. So influence comes from not necessarily having all the best resources, but having the taking decisive action with what you have. So how can you use your voice, use your network, use your skills, um, rather rather than waiting to be like completely ready for something? Another, I guess this is the last one, and with this I'll finish. Okay, then we'll do our private Q&A, and that is to recognize and encourage recognize and encourage moral courage in others. So Devorah, in her song, she praises those who showed up. She publicly acknowledges the tribes that had courage and integrity and participated. You want to be a person who builds community, builds a family that rewards responsibility, not passivity. So in your community life, let's say you thank the volunteers who do things that you care about, back ethical choices that people make, amplify the quiet heroes that are behind the scenes. Um, Call it, find a way to call attention to them. It could be one of your children. It could be a spouse. It could be somebody in your book club who's always doing, the organizing and stuff. You want to um, shine a light on them. And then the last thing is to reflect after success. So victory is followed by song. So after a win, pause to reflect what went right, who showed courage, what did we learn. That turns it from um, just moving on to the next thing to trying to figure out what you learned from there. And also accepting personal responsibility for the moment that you're in. Every character in this story is judged by what they did or didn't do when it mattered. So, what did Devorah do? What did Barak do? What did Yael do? What did some of the tribes do and some of the tribes didn't do? So it's good to stop asking, is this my job? And start asking, what is required of me in this moment? Okay, that is um, that is what I prepared. So I'm going to stop the recording and invite you guys to come back for um, the private Q&A where we'll deal with all the issues that I laid out. Okay, I'll see you guys in a minute.